Traveling to Consciousness, exploring spiritual journeys to find answers in uncertainty.
What is up, you conscious monkeys? Welcome back to another episode of Traveling to Consciousness. As always, I'm your host, Clayton Kateri, and in today's amazing podcast episode, we are going to be joined by Amrit Sandhu. Did I get that right? I hesitated.
It's great. Thank you so much for having me here, Clayton. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Dude, it's an honor to have you, and you're certified by Eckhart, Tolle School of Awakening, which I think a lot of the podcasts we've talked about was The Power of Now. I know that book was so transformative on my journey. It was like, I definitely point back to that book as being the one that like unlocked me. But then just a few more of your credentials before we jump into that. You're the host of a incredible podcast called Inspire Evolution. And the thing we just briefly talked about that really wanted me to get you on here was you had done over 360 podcasts talking to people. Does it feel like 360? Because that's crazy to me.
In some ways it really does. It's a bit like parenting. We'll talk about parenting before I jumped on as well. It's a bit like parenting. In some ways, there's this saying in parenting where it's like the days are really long, but the years are really short. And it kind of feels like that with podcasting as well, maybe because the podcast is one of my babies. It definitely feels like that. Yeah, in some ways it feels like, oh, it's only been 360. It feels like I've been showing up for a minute. But in other ways it's like, yeah, wow, 360. And you know, sometimes I sit down and I'll just share what's on my mind, which is recently I went through this exercise of going back and having a look at each individual title, because I've been through so many different waves of the podcast, and even just how I used to title my episodes has been, you know, there's been seasons. The podcast has been weekly forever, and then recently we've gone up to twice a week. But when I mean seasons, it's like, oh, there's been seasons of me, how I've titled the podcast. It's like, and just giving them podcast title names. For those that are podcasters will know what I mean. And I recently went back and started retitling all the episodes, and I'm like 250 episodes in, and it's taken me about a month to retitle 250. And I'm like, this is a lot of episodes. This is like a lot, but it's actually been a really fun exercise because it's brought me back to revisit the energy of each podcast. Like, oh, what did we talk about there? Oh yeah, that's right, we talked about this. And then like trying to come up with a title with all that I know now to make the best title possible. So yeah, in many ways, long answer, feels like a lot. In some ways feels like I'm still just getting started, to be honest. Yeah.
Love it. That's great energy. And being a content creator, do you find that like going back and retitling your podcast, as you've seen any improvements on like your numbers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So recently in the last 12 months, I went through a program with a gentleman called Ali Abdal to grow a YouTube channel. And so I'll just provide some context as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. Because for the longest while, I had a podcast, which then I repurposed to YouTube, repurposed to Instagram, repurposed to Facebook, repurposed to all these different platforms, just to spread the kind of message that you have as well. You know, expanding consciousness, raising awareness about positivity and mindful living, and you know, all the good stuff. So all of that to sort of say, I was doing it on a podcast, and what I started to notice was we were repurposing stuff to YouTube, and YouTube was actually responding to, and it was just audio without any video aspect to it, and it was performing neck for neck with how Apple, Spotify, and everything all put together was performing on YouTube. And so I was like, there's something interesting happening here, that, you know, the podcast being quite well received on YouTube. And honestly, one of the biggest challenges I had when I was reaching out early days to podcast guests was like, every time they'd send back, it's like, hey, how many people are we actually speaking to? Which is a very valid sort of like, hey, can I get you on the podcast? And then their response is like, sure, how many people listen to the show? Can you send us a screenshot of your downloads, etc.? And because I was doing it weekly, it got to the point where I was not frustrated, but it was getting to the point where it was just like, it was so time consuming to do the back and forth. It was like, here's a screenshot of where I'm at today. Here's a screenshot of where I'm at 2 days later. Here's a screenshot of where I'm at 3 days later. So I started to recognize that if I could just grow enough social proof on YouTube, then I can just sort of start to point people and just say, hey, this is where YouTube's at. If this is worth your while and worth your time, just look at the metrics that are there and make a judgment call based on that. And it would slipstream one of the most arduous parts of the podcast booking process, which is actually the booking process is the most time intensive in many ways outside of editing. And so, yeah, that was kind of this mission to just go, okay, look, let's just grow something on YouTube because the social proof and the metrics are visible for people. And if the platform is big enough for people to want to get on, they'll want to get on. If not, then not. It'll save me all this screenshotting, which is taking a lot of time. And so I'd made that decision. And then subtly a couple of things happened. And it's interesting how these, things drop in. So also started to recognize once I made that sort of awareness around YouTube is also that the nature of my content, your content, is more suited to a platform like YouTube. And what do I mean by that? So ultimately I noticed that spirituality and the kind of conversations around expanding your consciousness, living a life that's lived well, oftentimes coming back to the principles of nature and philosophy. These are evergreen conversations. Like there are people in their 20s that want to know about this. There are people in their 30s that want to know about this. There are people in their 40s that want to know about this. So a conversation that I've had with a guest on the podcast, in the nature of my work, someone may be interested in listening into that conversation around flow states, let's say. 15 years from now, it's still going to be relevant because someone's still going to want to know how to drop into a flow state. Right? So all of that to say, YouTube favors evergreen content better than topical content, which is what I think when I look at podcasts now, like the way I look at it, when I look at a podcast feed, I only see someone's last 10 episodes, right? And so it's like you're only really as good as your last 10 episodes in some way, which is like, yep, these were the 10 things I most recently talked about. And it's like, great, it gives me an insight and an energy of your podcast, but I'm not really going to dig down into your past episodes and find out more about it. All of that to say, so that got me to the point where I started to resonate with YouTube a little bit better because it's like I've got spirituality content. It's much more aligned to like the evergreen nature of how YouTube and the search algorithm spins things up for people when they're actually curious, and it feels like a better fit. That meant I had to go video, so I started doing video podcasting, and I was going along for a while, and I'd hit a point where things were growing, but when I started a podcast, I remember I did a podcasting course and that really helped me get things off the ground. And then recently I realized, I haven't really done a YouTube course. I'm just doing a podcast, which I'm pumping out to YouTube. And the YouTube course came my way and I was like, maybe I should do a course on YouTube just to better understand the platform because I am giving it, like it is my primary platform. I've made that decision in my head, but I haven't really learned anything about the platform. And so, went down the path and ultimately started learning a lot about YouTube. And one of the things you learn once you start doing courses on YouTube, that a lot of it is the importance is, yes, on having really robust conversations for your audience. But in order to build a new audience, a lot of it comes down to your title and your thumbnail. And that was this massive learning point for me, which was now I see it as like a grocery store on YouTube. Like you go in and if things aren't like, there's certain things which are packaged a certain way in the grocery store, which look a bit more grassroots and organic. And those are the things that jump out of me. They've got a bit more Spartan sort of packaging. And I'm like, oh, that looks organic. Like, I want to check that out, and I'll pick it up and I'll look at it. Whereas there are certain things which are like, oh, that looks like it's laden with sugar. I'm not going to pick that off the shelf, right? And so I start to see YouTube a little bit like this grocery store thing. And it's like, okay, my thumbnails and my titles are very important in order to how I communicate to my audience. So that then led me down this rabbit hole of going back to recognizing my podcast and going, oh, wow, like there's been, like I said, waves of consistency in how I've labeled my podcast in audio format only. And that gave me this major sort of like, whoa, okay, I need to go back and maybe just retitle some of the episodes. And I started from scratch. From zero, I would say, and worked my way from like the origin all the way back through the podcast. Another one of the things that happened is I'd never really numbered my episodes. Like you said, 360 now. And I started to notice that actually podcasts that have been podcasting for quite some time, really, there's a lot of social proof that's garnered through a podcast that's actually had episodes in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And I was like, oh, there's a whole lot of social proof that's missing. Like I said, we're only as good as the last 10 episodes. If in your last 10 episodes, it clearly says this is episode 360, then someone's like, oh, well, this is a really established podcast. Like in their psyche, when they're visiting the podcast, it already sort of says this, oh, like this is something that's established, robust. I can connect to it really deeply. So that also led me down the path to retitling everything. And then, there are subtle nuances in terms of how to differently title for YouTube versus titling for the podcast. We can get into that rabbit hole as well. But that's a very long answer to sort of describing why it was so important to retitle the podcast. And it's everything that I've learned as a content creator to where I'm at 7 years into the journey, as opposed to when I just started.
No, it's so cool. I don't think we've ever had like a deep dive into like YouTube as a spiritual content creator before, because it's so time consuming. Like there's no short way around it, right? So you're saying here that you had to go back, you retitled, redid the thumbnails. I feel like I've seen, and I haven't put too much effort into my YouTube. I kind of just like quick edit, throw it up. Do you do like a lot of editing around like the first minute or so? How important do you feel like that is to really pull people in?
Yeah. So, the good thing about YouTube is that you can also model success really well. And so, yes, the first minute is very important, because basically what you're doing is A, trying to get people to click on your content, and B, trying to get people then you're rewarding the click, right? And that's where, a lot of channels fail, because they'll have a click, but it's very clickbaity, and the first, you can tell by the first 30 seconds that this isn't really aligned to what they got me to click on. But obviously trying to create content in alignment with my values, and from a spiritual aspect, there is no part of me that wants to be clickbaity, right? It wants to make sure that people click and get access to good content, but then also the content, it really speaks to them and really helps enrich their lives. All of that to say, for a podcast, a good hack was to create a trailer for the podcast. So you take the best bits out of the podcast that you think are the most compelling, and then you stick them into a 30-second, 60-second, 90-second trailer that goes in at the front of the podcast. And then someone can, as soon as they click, it's like, this was the title, this was the thumbnail, and then the first 30 seconds speaks to like, oh, that is really compelling. I do want to find out more. And then they'll listen to the full-length episode. Because otherwise what happens is they've got a title and a thumbnail. Let's talk about it without the trailer. Then they have to wait. My episodes go for about 2 hours, sometimes 60 minutes. And so then they've got to wait, and they've got to, sift through with that pan of I've visualized like someone mining for diamond in the old days, sift through all the dirt and fighting that diamond. And that might be 20 minutes in, 40 minutes in. They don't know. It's a massive commitment on their part to sort of see whereas the highlight reel gives them a real quick opportunity. Obviously it doesn't cover a lot of ground, but it gives them an opportunity going, oh yeah, no, I'm fascinated by, could be anything. I'm fascinated by said topic, and I'm really looking forward to listening to this. I'll put up to, the first 20 minutes and listen to that, and they might even check out the timestamps, and the timestamps are there, and it's like, cool, actually this conversation happens 30 minutes in, click on that, navigate their way there. So I think it's critically important after the title and thumbnail. The first 30 to 90 seconds, I think, is very important as well.
No, that totally makes sense, because I know I have been I've been very lackadaisical, let's say, with YouTube. It's kind of just nice thumbnail, nice title, but creating that first 90 seconds, I've known the videos that I actually put that effort into, they do pretty well. It also seems like the retention graphs, I'd be interested to hear about yours. I guess we're just making this a spiritual YouTube podcast about podcast YouTube. If you've noticed how it seems like in the first minute and a half is where majority of people drop off. But then after that, it seems pretty steady. Even for like my 3-hour ones, if you make it past the first minute and a half, like the probability of you finish the episode is pretty high.
Yeah, so mine's are about 15 minutes. So in the 15 minutes, the first 15 minutes is a lot. Like it starts to go from 0 all the way down to from 100% people watching to like stabling out at 50, 40%. Once they've made it past the 15-minute mark, it's just, like you said, it just flattens out. If you've made it past the first 15 minutes and you've tolerated me for that much, you're willing to tolerate me for another good hour or so.
So then, is that something you think about when you get into like the interview process of like that first 15 minutes, what you're going to talk about?
Not so much. It has started to. So we're always experimenting and growing, and this is a good insight, I guess. Like 7 years in, right? And I still feel like I'm getting started. So recently, like the last 2 episodes we released, my episodes all start with this, like, yo, welcome to the Inspired Evolution, right? So that's my intro. Super high energy, super fun, and yeah, touch wood. It's just, it's signature me. But having said that, recently we started to experiment with things, which was like, okay, like we're having the conversation, and what if after the trailer, normally I do an intro for the guest, I do a whole bunch of stuff. What happens if I just don't intro the guest? We take out even my introduction, and we literally start not even asking my first question. If it contextually makes enough sense, we just start with the guest's answer. So you've gone from the intro to the guest already telling you something, or you've gone from the intro to my first question. How does that work? And so it hasn't been too conclusive in terms of whether it's performed better or not. But I guess what I'm trying to communicate is we're always trying and experimenting things for retention. I don't really bring too much of that into the conversation though, because I don't really want to. Yeah. So what I really want to say, I guess, and what's on my heart to say, and it might sound a bit woo-woo, but the conversation to me is pretty sacred. Like it's pretty special what happens in a podcasting conversation when 2 individuals sit down. There's like this real, it is a dance, there's a bit of a, I don't want to say bromance, but there is something that opens up between 2 individuals when they're sharing so deeply amongst themselves in a conversation. And, I found it nothing short of profound, having, experienced this again and again, yes, in podcasting, but also in, my work as a coach. And so all of that to say, I try to honor the conversation to the best of my ability. I'm used to my format of, starting, with the big bang, with the you, and then, allowing it to go. But if there are things in post, in editing that, me and the editing team can work together to sort of dial in and try and sort of see if we can, support the channel along further, because we do believe in the content. We feel like it deserves for it to be shared, widely, because especially given the nature of the world, and where it's at, then we'll try and make those tweaks if they're available to us. And similar to, I wanted to share before, like where you're at in terms of like, you're saying, oh yeah, sometimes I whack together a trailer, sometimes I don't. Where I have done it, it does reward, like I have been rewarded for like the content sort of doing a little bit better. That's how it starts. You always try and make those 1% shifts, and sometimes it feels like you're making a 1% shift every week. Sometimes it feels like you're making a 1% shift every 6 months. But, as you continue to stack them on top of each other, the show and the channel continues to grow as you implement these shifts.
Now, how does like all of this kind of like tie into your spirituality? Because I'm hearing like a lot of like these similar kind of key phrases, right? 1% better. A lot of just honestly, just positive, good advice, not even spirituality. Let's be real here. Just 1% better, just get like a little bit of improvement, kind of stuff like that. And then I think there was even another little bit in there. You mentioned something, like the conversation being sacred, which is a beautiful way to put it, because I can see what you mean by it feels a little woo woo, but at the same time, it's like, anytime you're truly engaged, it seems like with someone, you're like locked in, you're eye to eye, you got these headphones on, you hear exactly what the other person's saying, nothing else matters. It's almost like some sort of portal opens up. And I've had, especially in person, I'm not sure if you've done any in person, but like if you're in person, it just, the time flies by. And I've had even guests who are like, wait, that's been 3 hours? They think it's been like 20 minutes or something. I'm just like, yeah, dude, like that was the time. So like where is the question in here? I don't even know where the question is. I guess I'm interested in how you see like this combination between making a good YouTube video, but then like keeping that balance of making sure that you're not completely distorting what the message is of the entire podcast.
Yeah, so I don't really think too much about the YouTube video. There are content creators that I follow that are extremely good at creating, their masters at YouTube and creating a YouTube video and having a really great conversation. And so I'll give you an example of who I'm thinking of. So a gentleman that whose podcast I have a lot of time and space for, Modern Wisdom, Chris Williamson. For those that have tuned into Chris's work, he's he's a different frequency to the work that I put out into the world, but his podcast has done extremely well. When I started listening into his podcast, listening to full-length episodes, I found it very jarring as an experience, personally. I love Chris. His whole thing is tailored towards insight. But what he does is you've got this question, and like one question doesn't necessarily segue into the next question, And this was probably about a year ago. I've noticed recently that it's a bit smoother, the transitions, because he's probably aware that this has started to happen. But previously, and this started when he first got Jordan Peterson on his show, who's an amazing guest to have on anyone's show, right? So when he got him on his show really took off because of that appearance. And I'm listening to the questions, and question A didn't lead to question B, didn't lead to question C, didn't lead to question D, didn't lead to question E. And I was trying to understand, like, why someone that was so professional wasn't, because like you and I are here, not to say that conversational flow is professional, but it feels schmick. Like the way you and I are chatting here today, like you go from one thing and then you evolve into the next and you glean an insight into the next. It just feels smooth, touch wood. It feels really nice. So I was like, why is it being so jarring? And I looked back and I started to realize a few weeks later, watching the clips roll out on his channel, which was like, question A was a particular clip that he knew, like Elon Musk, like Jordan Peterson's thoughts on Elon Musk, and that's like, oh, that's a very clicky, like something I would click on. Like, what does Jordan Peterson think about Elon Musk? And so that was one of his questions. And then he went into like, Jordan Peterson on the carnivore diet. And it's like those two things don't segue from one to the other, right? But he's asked the question because he's figured out that someone's going to want to click on Jordan Peterson and the carnivore diet. It's almost like he's gone to Jordan Peterson's page, had a look at his top 10 videos and tried to create 30 questions that sort of line up to that and then ask him that in a 2.5 hour interview format. When I understood that, it was like, this is someone who's optimizing, like you described, the conversation for what they're doing on YouTube. Yeah, which I think is brilliant. Just being able to be aware that someone's doing that. For me personally, again, like I said, the conversation's sacred. I'm very different, and also my content's different. Yeah, it's like very spiritual. So for me, the places that we can go into when we're just trusting and surrendering and flowing, like sometimes I'll come to a podcast, and my process, just to give you an insight, is I'll read the books, I'll listen to a bunch of other interviews, and then I'll script 50 questions. And that's my background is like an engineer, PhD, whatever. All of that was like studying really religiously. And so again, I need those 50 questions for my psychology to feel like, yeah, I'm prepared. But then now, like, I don't lean into those questions at all, really. It's just my preparation. Once I get to the podcast, I just surrender, let go, have the conversation. And sometimes a lot of the stuff that's in the questions comes out quite well. Sometimes we meander, like I did a podcast, like literally 2 episodes ago, Matt Kahn, him and I got into a podcast. We were meant to be talking about shedding the physical identity and giving way to your soul's presence. And we were just talking, and midway through the conversation, he was talking about, how are you? And I said, oh, look, sometimes when I'm having a challenging day, I put it as I'm having a challenging day. And he's like, that sounds like a bit of bravado. It doesn't really sound like you're actually like honoring how you're deeply feeling. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But also like, if you're putting your best foot forward. And he was just, and we started unpacking that and the bravado and the masks that we wear in society. So it wasn't not aligned to where we were going. But we opened up this really deep sort of rich vein of just allowing the conversation, which again, I believe is sacred, to tap what was meant to be shared in the space. And, you look at the feedback on that conversation, it's like, wow, I really needed to hear this the way that it was shared. And, it takes a little bit of vulnerability on my part to open up and be like, hey, this is kind of where I think I landed around this, but it's also really useful. And that's the blessing of the inspired evolution and having a podcast named that way as well, is that I'm always on the path. I'm always growing. I don't really have to be positioned as an expert, touch wood, but, after you do like 300, 400 episodes, you tend to learn a thing or two.
7 years making a podcast and putting out YouTube episodes. You're close.
Somewhere. Yeah, I'm still on the journey. Like I said, I feel like I'm just getting started. But all of that, sorry, just to say, yeah, for me, I don't really think too much about what's going to go happen on YouTube. Once I have the podcast and the conversation, then we go down and sit down and go, okay, this is a really great conversation. How do we package this for the platform? Like I said, when you go into Coles or, your supermarket, you're looking at the aisles and you're like, okay, no, what's the packaging? So we focused on making a really good, something digestible, something that people really savor, really want to eat. And then from there, it's like, oh yeah, now I've also got to be able to package it in a way that people want to reach for it off the shelf. So we'll just do that retroactively. And maybe, there's greater levels of mastery where we adopt a different approach. But for me at the moment, this feels really robust because, going down the path of the conversation and allowing it to espouse what it wants to espouse. Again, I'm going to go there. I don't really believe in coincidence too much. So I think it's interesting, even the conversation you and I are having right now, like the way I view it is like, yes, there's probably some sort of intention that brought me to the call. There's some intention that brought you to the call. But even the way you conduct your podcast, I'm a big fan of, because there's a lot of trust and a lot of surrender in the conversation to go where it needs to go. And, there's also that aspect of there are people tuning into this conversation right now, which is not at the time of recording. But when you start to unpack certain things, especially when you start to look at some quantum physics and reality, it's like in quantum physics, one of the interesting things, leaning into my background as an engineer a little bit, the variable that they're manipulating and working with is time, because what they're starting to discover is everything is one big eternal now. So consciousness as we experience it is modulating, it's very linear, is modulating our experiences, this, then that, then that, then that, then that. But somehow in the quantum, everything is happening all at once. It's just human beings having a linear experience, which is very trippy for your mind to sort of start to drop into. But if you start tuning into that a little bit, you start to realize, even the person that's listening to the podcast in the future between you and I right now needed to hear this at that point, potentially. And their future intention self has also showed up to this podcast to influence its direction a certain way. Now, I know that's super woo, but, touch wood, it invites me again further to just be open, surrender, trust the process, trust the flow, and allow what's meant to be carried through in the podcast to be there. And in some ways, it also takes a lot of pressure off because you don't have to perfect the podcast, right? It's what it's meant to be, just honor the moment.
Well, yeah, and I don't think that's really super woo at all. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with that word because I think that spirituality, for the most part, has been hijacked into the super feminine, right? And it doesn't work. If you want to know something that drives me crazy, it's whenever like you find in someone's Instagram bio, like embodying the divine feminine. It's like, okay, if you're not even talking about both of them, then we have a problem here. Like you have to embody divine masculine if you're going to also embody the divine feminine. Like it's, how you're saying earlier, like it's just like a teeter a little bit percent better. It's like, you can't let one of those get too out of hand. Otherwise you're going to be on the brink of either chaos if you go too far feminine, or just too tyrannical order where it's fascinating, right? Because like, and I see this in our conversation, and even in, if we break it out to looking at YouTube as a whole, right? Because the masculine is what's going to sit down and be like, okay, what is it that people want to hear? Okay, do we put that at the first 90 seconds? All right, how do we package that? What's this? But then what we're doing right here is a little bit more feminine. It's a little bit more, well, it feels like this word pops up, that word. So to bring this back even to what you're saying, I mean, quantum physics, I think we have a lot to learn. I think if you want to go to movies, teach us a lot. I think there's a lot that could be learned from Quantum Mania, the Ant-Man movie. I find that there's a lot of truths in there that haven't been fully unpacked yet, that I think we're just starting to figure out. Why do I say this? Oh, and this is where I wanted to bring it back to, right? Which is about the idea of the power of now, which is another fascinating connection we have here. And I think that when you say now, right, someone could be watching this in the year 2030, but you and I are having this conversation in 2024. So the concept of now is still the same, but our minds have abstracted it to being a different time and space. And so I don't think it's that woo-woo, but it needs that concrete. It needs something concrete so that it doesn't completely just float off to oblivion, if you will, so that we can actually hold on to it in this, like, for this conversation. Otherwise, like you said, it becomes too, what you called woo woo, but like abstract, too feminine, becomes too floaty. So it has to have like some reason to have a purpose for us, right? In this now, this one, not that one. But like, and I think Eckhart Tolle does an amazing job of that, with explaining how it can truly bring you to peace, of realizing like, if you're not enjoying this moment, then there's no reason that you would enjoy that next moment either.
And there's so much of us in common day society that is doing the trade. And I think the reason The Power of Now is such a potent book for so many of us, because I remember the first time I read it, I was just like, whoa, was because, well, when I start tuning into the conversations I've had with Stephen Kotler on the podcast, who's like, Flow Research Collective founder and wrote Stealing Fire, and really started to bring the work of flow states to the common zeitgeist. He talks about society being, 21st century living being baked in, like there's 20% anxiety just baked into existence, right? And anxiety, as we look at it, is, and so this is, I struggled with depression in my past, touch wood, and, one of the things I had to learn through The Power of Now was spending time in the past is the root cause, is a root cause for your psyche to be in depression. Spending time in the future is the root cause for anxiety. Yeah, because when you think about the past, I should have, I could have, I would have, oh man, that happened. And you can feel even the frequencies I'm saying, those few words that it's starting to to bring you, depress you down. It's like, oh, my being is like, it's not good enough in the present moment, I should have done. So that's like depression. And then in the future, it's like, oh, I wonder how that's going to, and tomorrow I've got to, and the day after. And you can already feel like that anxiety sort of seeping in, right? So the future is anxiety, the past is depression. And it's not that we're not meant to think about the past, not meant to think about the future. Absolutely we are. That's how society got to civilization as it is today. Our ability to learn from our mistakes, forecast and plan for the future. Like, for God's sakes, I'm a coach, right? So I help people have a look at their future. But the thing is to be anchored in the present moment. And the key thing that I think is so important is because of that 20% anxiety baked in, like people naturally being so future focused because of the way capitalism is run. It's like, I'm going to trade my time and energy today to, build an investment for tomorrow, or I'm going to sacrifice some stuff today so my children may be able to have this tomorrow. You're trading your present moment for a future state. It's baked in anxiety. Yeah. And so the message and the lesson around, but if you're consistently showing up tilted towards the future, you have this anxious, sort of frequency. That's how I describe it.
That's a great sound effect.
Then you've got that, and then you're going to show up with your kids later on and not having learned to tether yourself to the present moment, but you're tethered to the frequency of you doing so much. Those moments are just passing you by. These are some of the most present moments, where you're meant to be present with your kids, touch wood. And so learning to anchor yourself in the present and say, yes, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in the future. Yes, there's a whole bunch of stuff in my past, which I could have totally done better. I'll be the first to admit that. But here in the present moment, it's like learning to then modulate and come back to that and start to recognize there's a whole healing that generally has to happen, I find, because it's quite uncomfortable to just sit there with yourself and just be like, yep, I'm here. I can't remember whose quote it was, but the quote goes along the lines of, most of mankind's problems come from their inability to sort of sit in a dark room by themselves, I
think that was some Stoic philosopher.
Yeah. And I'm a big fan of that because it's just like, it's so true. Like, even when I sit down and pause and it's like, yeah, there's so much running around doing things, got to do this, got to do that. Why? And it's like, and this comes back to your point about the masculine and the feminine, the masculine being the doing and the feminine being the being. There's that dance between the two things that's ever present. And to champion one over the other is like you said earlier, I don't think is appropriate. But I think different things are required in different phases. But we are in a society that has been overly doing for the longest while. And that's why I think a lot of things are breaking down. People talk about this new awareness, new consciousness that's breaking through. We are moving into a state of greater and greater being. There is a feminine sort of awakening that's happening. And all that really means to me is people are being called back into being as opposed to having been so much doing. And it's actually quite a beautiful healing that's going on. But for those that are obsessed with doing, it is such a cracking, like it is like, whoa, like how do I stop doing? It's like, it's everything I know. It's my DNA, it's my fabric. And especially why there's all these men's circles, men's group popping up, especially like what I see in my local environment. I get brought along to speak at these engagements, and it's, it's interesting because men are really, there is a crisis in identity for men, but it's I'll say it's not necessary. It's just a shift, because doing and the masculine wave of like where capitalism was at, the way I sort of see it is we've put up the bones of everything, and we've put up, some of the fascia, but now it's like the meat and the skin is getting put on, and that's the more feminine aspect of society and civilization as we're going. And I think that's the shift that's coming, and something really beautiful is about to emerge. Touch wood.
No, for sure. And it seems like, again, I think this comes down to programming, which has happened at so many levels. You can see it in just about every religion, that it seems like there are corrupted energies that are programming people, that is bringing on that stress that you were talking about, right? And I guess, you can point to it in many different areas. I think that, that's definitely an element of it is, and, a part of me thinks that this comes back to whenever people talk about the patriarchy, which for me, it's still sometimes it makes sense to me when people use that term. Sometimes it doesn't. But I think the underlying, and I think the reason is the underlying thing that you're kind of touching on here, which is that it's almost that the feminine, whether it's male or female, right? Because we both have masculine and feminine energy. Everybody does. It seems that feminine energy in general has been, whether on purpose or not, I think it's probably been on purpose, has been corrupted. And it's not, and women probably feel it a little bit more than men, but men have been told to not feel it in the first place, right? With, just don't talk about this type of stuff isn't important, cover up your feelings, men don't cry kind of thing. And it seems though that programming has come in, that and maybe it's just at a whole, but women probably feel it a little bit more. And I'm kind of just putting this together now. So if I sound like I'm rambling incoherently, it's because my brain's making new neuron connections. Do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I do. So I think the way I put it is, I think women are working on a seventh sense, while men are busy working on a sixth sense. I do think women are much more intuitively and emotionally evolved and matured. And I think that, I look at it and this, whether it's right or wrong, for me, I just picture this, a campfire from like, just a couple of thousand years ago. And men are out individually hunting, or even collectively as a pack hunting, and there's certain types of communication which are very, again, linear, doing sort of focused to sort of make sure that we bring back something for the tribe. Whereas women are rearing kids, helping, like, because I went and spent some time with the Masai Mara in Africa, and they're the ones making the huts, building infrastructure, making sure that, they're all, like, where they're going to sleep that night is safe, rearing the animals and stuff like that. So there's that nurturing that they've afforded, but there's also a sense of community amongst each other, which they're spending all day, every day. And, someone says, how's your son? And it's like, oh yeah, he's okay. But, another mother's able to tune in and just read, is like, that okay is not actually an okay, whereas for men it's like, oh, well, he said he was all right. Like, all good, Yeah. And that's because we haven't had those intricacies of communication woven into, how we've evolved. And yes, over time we've evolved more and more and more. But I do think that's where females are generally more evolved emotionally than men generally are. And, I might get cancelled for saying that, but generally you also find like men are physically, I wouldn't say more evolved, but like you can just see it in like sports, like the fastest serve in tennis, which is my favorite sport. A man serves faster than a woman does, right? Just because of the way the male structure is made, and that's because of what's been cultivated through the ages. And that's probably how I'd put it. So all of that to say, I think women are working on a seventh sense while men are busy working on a sixth sense. And when it comes to intuition and these dialing into the energetics, I do think one of the shifts that's happening, especially as I started to podcast more and more people around, soul and that awareness, is that as we bring ourselves, this is an interesting dance, and maybe we can weave this into the conversation and try and make it linear, is like the power of now is about bringing your five sensory awareness into the present moment, because your senses are like taking you here, taking you there, it sort of corrupts and hijacks you. Once you've sort of learned that, then there's this whole, but I'm also feeling in the present moment, like something's off, but I can't describe what it is when I walk into a room. It's like, what's that? It's like you're picking in on energy, but that's not coming to you from your five senses. It's coming from a sixth sense, right? So then you start to become extra sensory. Now that starts to, again, picks the thread of becoming a bit woo-woo, but it gets really interesting because it's like, actually, I'm tuning into things, I'm experiencing things a certain way. And it's like, okay, and the teachers that have popped on the podcast saying, yeah, that's the next shift, is we're becoming extra sensory. And again, back to the shift is somewhat more feminine, because women are already more open to those extrasensory perceptions. Men are, I don't want to say brutish, but we're sort of learning that a little bit slower, and we're slowly getting there. And that's where we can learn from our female counterparts. One of the things I will also go on like a whole little mini rant to sort of share as well is, for me, I think it's worth noting that I'm a male with feminine energy. Yeah. And for most people, like when I go along to men's circles and I'm doing the talks and stuff, they're just like, what sort of male says he's got feminine energy? Like, what's wrong with you, bro? Like, and the truth of the matter is, no, but basically all that really means to me is I'm a male that's got the operating system of love. And generally you've got the masculine operating system is freedom. Yeah. So when you're male with a masculine operating system, you're operating towards and for freedom. And it's really interesting because in certain South American cultures, their wisdom actually isn't of two genders. They have a wisdom of 5 genders. Yeah. So if you follow along for a quick sec, you have a female with feminine energy, so a woman that's driven by love. And you have a male with a masculine energy, which is a man driven by freedom. Then you have a female with masculine energy, which is a woman driven by freedom. Yeah. Then you have a male with feminine energy, which is a man driven by love. And then you have this androgynous, energy, which is actually, for them, that's the highest evolution of male, female. And when you look back into some older Hindu scriptures, like there's descriptions of like, yes, he was born a man, but he was also appeared as a female at certain times. Like, there's these androgynous sort of spiritual creatures. Creatures is probably the wrong word, sorry, but I think you get my point. So that sort of blows the ideology open quite a bit. And for me, it's profound to realize. Like I read like David Dider, The Way of the Superior Man, and it was a great read, but at the same time, it was like, this is not for me. It's written for men that are of masculine energy. So why do I bring this into the conversation? Because knowing that about myself is really helpful, because love has a very different shadow to what freedom does, right? So as a man with love as my operating system, like I genuinely go out of my way to care. It's why I make Touchwood such a great coach, right? So like there'll be a touch point, like, in my coaching program, we've got access to each other 24/7 over Messenger. And then, we do 2 calls a month. And then, there's all this other stuff. Every course and stuff I've got, is yours for the duration you're in the coaching program. Now, that to sort of say, why do you have access to me over 24/7 over Messenger? And people pinging me left, right, and center. But for someone that's operating from love and care, it's naturally going to be the way that I prefer to show up, because I'm genuinely invested in you, right? So like I've leveraged my strengths. But one of the things to look at, like in its shadow, and now let's look at just like an old home. Yeah, like an old home, maybe let's just put it back to like even just in the 60s or something. You've got mother cooking in the house, and you've got father doing, a trade, and he's like out there working. And, this was a time where the internet didn't really exist. It's kind of the time where, a guy could move 7 kilometers and start a new family because he just moved towns and she would never see him again. Right? We're like talking Wild Wild West vibes, right? Let's just go there somewhere. Don't know where to place it time wise, but just visualize that. So what you'll notice is men are trying to build freedom for their family. So that's that pure masculine energy. But in its shadow, like I said, like I'm going out for a pack of smokes, and he goes out for a pack of smokes and never comes back. He ran away. So in his shadow, he's fleeting. Yeah, that masculine energy is fleeting. That's that male with that masculine energy. And the woman, like the female with the feminine energy, her thing is love. And so she creates this beautiful home. She loves her partner. She creates a loving family. But also she's like, oh, don't go out or don't do this. And like in the shadow of love can get clingy. Right. And then you see that manifest as like, male, female sort of dynamics. It's like one's trying to run away and the other one's trying to hold on to it because it's like clingy and free. But the truth is, in their most maturest expression, love and freedom are in a dance together. It's like the freedom to love. And I love my freedom is like the purest expression of the male feminine dance, in my humble opinion. Right. But then we have the shadow aspects of it, which is like one is clingy and one is, trying to run away. So all of that to say, there are men that are clingy, right? That's just the shadow of love. And there are women that are fleety, right? And that doesn't make them right or wrong. It's just like, oh, you're a different type of makeup, right? So there are 5 genders potentially rather than just 2 in terms of like biological makeup. Like you can be a male with masculine energy. You can be a female with feminine energy. You can also be a male that's, got feminine energy. And I sort of identify with that because I'm a male that's, operating from love. In my shadow, I can be clingy.
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation. Let's dissect this for a bit, because I think there's a lot of things that you brought up that I like either don't understand or I quasi agree with. So the first thing I 100% agree with, right? Number one is that the male and female is different from masculine, feminine energy, right? So I would say the best example I've ever given to someone with this is if you have a gay couple, right? 2 men. One is usually going to hold more feminine energy, one's going to hold more masculine energy. And you can see that even with female couples as well. Where I guess I'm getting a little confused is whenever you're saying that you're kind of dividing it, right? So you're saying that a male is either freedom or love, and then a woman is freedom or love. Because I guess in my experience, it's both. So for example, right, like I'm running for Congress, and I'm doing that I would say for both of those reasons, to create freedom for all, but then it's also out of love for people that I'm pursuing that. So can you help me like zero in here what you're saying here with this?
Yeah. So if I was leaning into the NLP background, touch wood, the fact that you brought up freedom first, but then also love. Do you see how you articulated that even? Like if you rewind back 30 seconds, it's like I'm championing this because of freedom.
Sure.
But then also because of the love of the people. I'm not saying like, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a balance between all of us. I'm just saying there's like, 51-49, like nobody is exactly 50-50. That's that androgynous spirit, right? All of us have a slight skew. So I would say I'm probably 55 love, 45 freedom as a makeup. Yeah. So I have a skew. That's my natural tendency and propensity. Should everybody be 50-50? I don't think so. I think we have natural predispositions based on our upbringings, based on how we're sort of raised, and also based on the lessons that our soul wanted to learn in this particular lifetime. Potentially it chose who it wanted to be here. So that to sort of say, when you're describing it, I'm hearing your responses like 55% masculine and 45% feminine. I'm not discounting that there is a feminine drive in there. I'm not discounting that there's a masculine drive in there. But it's important to recognize that, there is a dance in there that's happening.
Well, yeah, I certainly agree with that. But then to that point, right, I guess at least the way I see it is that there would be times where I would be more feminine versus more masculine. Like there are definitely situations where I fall into my feminine, like if we're talking like big picture, generic, like I guess I would side masculine man, but to me it doesn't feel like an appropriate thing to identify as, like, because I guess my thought process is going back more to what we were talking about whenever I was saying, like, you know, a lady saying, oh, the embodiment of divine femininity. It's like, but are you embodying the divine masculine as well? Right? Like, in my mind, I agree with the dance piece, but in my mind, it's like there's times and situations where maybe it's a bit more feminine and a bit more masculine. And I think podcasting, even to just give another example, right? You might feel this as well, is that if you're the guest, I would, whenever I'm the guest, at least I'll say this, we'll leave you out of this. Whenever I'm the guest, I feel like I'm more in that flow state of following the direction that the host is taking us. So I guess that's where my, if you want to call it a contention with that conversation would be.
Yeah. So peeling back into the conversation. So for me, taking the podcasting example, it's very masculine of us to schedule a time, to pick a tool like Riverside to record our conversation on, because it produces the highest quality recording that we know how to get out. But then it's quite feminine of us to rock up into the conversation, then just sort of flow and trust and see where it takes us. And then afterwards, you're going to chop it up, put it up on YouTube and do all the things with the podcast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's quite masculine again. Yeah. Now, I'm zooming out all as far as we can potentially zoom out, right? So that's the day-to-day, and I totally get that, you know, you can show up masculine, you can show up feminine, you can leverage those abilities. That totally happens. When I zoom all the way out, though, like I'm literally interstellar and I'm looking back at Clayton. It's like, why is Clayton doing this? What is his deepest driving primordial force, if you want to look at it that way, right? He has a life force. Why is he doing this? Well, the podcast is his vehicle to expressing freedom, right? Or the podcast is really his expression for the love of humanity, you know? And one of those is they're both going to be present potentially to some degree. One might just edge out over the other, right? From that real interstellar high meta perspective. And it's like, that particular particle slightly more masculine than feminine in its presentation, right? Or slightly more feminine than masculine. And again, you know, I think it's an important conversation we're having. But also to round out the conversation and make it really important is, I think it's noting that everybody is required for the experience of humanity to exist the way that it is. So there's no right or wrong in terms of you presenting a certain way or presenting another way. Like, I just want to make that absolutely clear. We're all needed. And we're all actually needed to be our truest selves for this to work in the harmony that's available. Because at the moment, a lot of us are trying to live into other people's expectations, other people's shoes, other people's identities and stuff. And that's a big part of, you know, what I find myself unpacking for people as a coach. But I just wanted to sort of park that in there. That's a whole nother massive conversation, but I'm conscious we're still in the conversation that we're having here. Yeah.
No, it's definitely important. Of course, I think everyone, I see it as it's a giant picture, it's a giant jigsaw puzzle, and everyone has their exact piece that needs to be placed in that puzzle. Otherwise, the picture falls apart. In this conversation, right, we're saying that, because I think this really spawned from, let me take a step back here. I guess it's the and piece. Because to me, I just feel like there's usually, I feel like both are just a driving force. I know the way I articulated, right, was freedom and love. But to me, that's just because we don't have a word for freedom and love. Unless that word exists and I'm not aware of it, right? Because if that word existed,
why isn't it love and freedom? I just, and this is me just being a coach for a sec. Why would you not say love and freedom?
I could say love and freedom.
You probably could, but left to your own idiosyncrasies and vices, when you're not shining a light on it, it's freedom and love for you, naturally flowing. It's like sometimes when you hold your fingers a certain way, doing it this way feels odd, but doing it this way feels normal, right? And so then it's why is it that way? And it's like, you know, you can,
Well, this is interesting. I would say that it would probably change based on who I'm talking to, because I mean, even in the way that I'm, running for Congress, there's certain issues that I can just intuitively feel are coming up for certain people versus others. You know, if I knock on someone's door and it's an older gentleman and he has like, you know, deer heads hanging up behind him in his living room, right? My mind goes to NRA, guns. Okay, we're going to talk about that. Or if I go and then it's someone who's, you know, let's say a 20-year-old girl, it's like my mind's going to go somewhere else that is something they're going to be more interested in speaking on. So, you know, to this point, you know, hypothetically, if the roles were reversed and I was the person who was being interviewed, maybe I would have said love and freedom. Or, you know, you could also put another hypothetical in there that because I am presenting myself to be a congressman, which tends to be more of a masculine role, masculine energy, of course, women can be congressmen as well. Then that could also be what's influencing me maybe to say freedom and love. But I still don't see that it would boil down to an area where culturally we would say, you know, this idea, I guess, of 5 genders, where it's masculine man. I mean, I agree like that the chemical makeup of people can shift feminine to masculine, but then to put a layer of, it seems to me that puts another layer then of freedom versus love, and then another layer of placing that on top of gender to be 4 of them. Do you kind of see where I'm going with all that?
I can see that you're challenged by me creating more divisiveness when unity is really at the essence and heart of spirituality. I also think in your example you've given, and I'm going to make this more confusing for a quick second. Hopefully it makes it more clarifying down the line, because you rocking up to people and adjusting your tone and adjusting how you meet the person with deer heads on his wall versus how you're, you know, meeting the person that, you know, has a different sort of diet. That's quite feminine because it's very flow. Yeah, from an outset. And I identify with that, right? That's what makes me such a great podcaster, right? Which is like, I'm fluid, I'm open. It's like, hey, when I rock into one conversation with someone, I can be one way. And when I rock into a conversation with another person, I can rock in another way. But then you will meet like, and that's, you know, male love energy, because love is nurturing. It's sort of, it looks at all of its kids and goes, hey, this one's beautiful for this and this one's beautiful for that and that's beautiful for that. And it accepts all. Yeah, that's that love energy. But then you'll also meet a male masculine, like, and one of my closest friends is a fear coach. What you see is what you get. Yeah, like he's a fear coach. He's full on. He's intense. He's shredded. He's like militant. He's, you know, it's like, get up at 4 a.m., do your cold plunge, like, let's do this, you know. And he's very, I don't want to say one-dimensional, but that freedom, he is very archetypically his signature, because that's that freedom, tip of the spear sort of energy, which is just pushing for that, right? And that's totally fine, but that's a male with masculine energy embodied, right? And this is what a male with feminine energy looks like embodied. It's much more nurturing, much more adaptable, much more like, okay. Whereas for fear, it's not that he's not adaptable to his environment, but it's a much more masculine approach, right? It's less relationship oriented. It's more like, this is who I am. How do I carve out the space for me? For me, it's like, this is who I am. How do we, you know, find a space for Amrit? You know, it's very different in how we approach the dynamics. And I'm not here labeling you as being a more masculine man or a feminine man. It's more the understanding the dynamics. The big intention for me is for people to recognize where we first started the conversation is that male and being a male, like biologically, doesn't necessarily guarantee you being male frequency or energy, and then being born female biologically doesn't guarantee you being female frequency. Yeah. And then because those two things.
Are you saying female frequency as in feminine and male frequency as in masculine?
And all I mean by feminine frequency is love, right? Love as your operating system. And then male.
Okay, so maybe that's what's tripping me up, because the way the conversation is it's making me think, and just based on the way this is being framed, it makes me think that there's an insinuation that, how do you articulate that? That's wrong. Well, what I'm thinking to say, but I don't fully believe this, is it seems like there's a Like there's one capacity without the other, almost like as if.
Yeah, and that's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Yeah. So firstly, we're untethering the fact that if you're born female, you have to nurture and love, and that's all you can do, right? Versus if you're born a male, you have to go out and hunt for freedom, and that's all you can do, right? So firstly, I'm trying to untether that, yeah? So then it's like, boom, you may be born in a male body or a female body, but you may be hunting for freedom, or you may be looking to nurture, right? And so now we've opened up 4 genders, right? That 4 different types of sorts of makeup, yeah? And that's not to say that my mate who's a fear coach is not going to be an amazing dad who nurtures his children. Absolutely. That feminine aspect is available to him. I'm not typecasting him saying, dude, everything that is feminine is out of your reach. Absolutely not. Yeah, but the life that he constructs for his children, the way that the man that he will be for his kids, will be someone that's more freedom oriented. So he's going to be driven by providing freedom for his kids. Yeah, that's going to be something that just drives him primordially in his being. And that's not to say that love isn't there. Love is absolutely there. He has a love for freedom. Yeah, you could almost argue. Yeah, so that's what his true love is. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, but I think you might be touching on what I think you're touching on now what was kind of poking at me, which is like, it feels almost like a chicken or egg question then. Because if you love something, you want it to be free, but to create freedom out of love.
And
right?
that's the highest expression of the masculine and the feminine, right? And that's that yin and yang, and that's why it feels like the chicken and the egg, yeah? That's the yin and yang literally embodied, right? Because in its highest expression, it's exactly what you're saying. There is a love for freedom, and freedom loves, like there's a freedom to love, yeah? And that's the yin and yang in the highest expression. But also, having been a coach and having coached hundreds of people, we're not all the divine masculine and divine feminine incarnate. We're having this 3D experience. And in the 3D experience, it's worthwhile acknowledging our shadows rather than just spiritually bypassing them to some degree. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but there is that I see it a lot where it's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to, like you said, I'm embodying the divine feminine, right? And it's like, yeah, but what is also your everyday stuff, which, we can potentially work with to find out what your passions are, what your purpose is, what's holding you back, why you're not doing the things you really want to do in life. And in that point, it's really good to put on the rubber gloves and allow the rubber to hit the road and go, okay, what is it that really is driving you, in this present moment? Like, what are you driven by? It's like, well, and, for the typical feminine mother, it'd be like, well, I just want my kids to have the best thing ever, and it's just like, oh, that's just pure love speaking back. So it's like, okay, that's one of your driving things. How do we take that to the nth degree? And you start to understand what's driving and motivating somebody, and you can start to leverage that to build more and more in alignment to, the things that they want as outcomes. And that's pretty much me just doing the work as a coach, touch wood. But for someone like my mate, which is like, hey, I just want to be free. I want to be able to build a lifestyle business, which gives me the ability to do this. And I want to be able to travel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, great. What's driving you? It's just like, just freedom to be me. And it's like, great, bro, let's work on that, and we start to unpack and then go, okay, this feels freeing. This would feel like a business where I'm managing 14 people. It's not for me. But a lean startup where I'm like, only got 3 people in my team. They all enable me to do what I want to do. That feels like me. It's much more freedom oriented. Yeah. And so that's where I'm sort of, I agree with you. Like in its highest expression, that there's a complete symbiosis between love and freedom. And when you zoom out, each of us playing the roles as particles, and maybe we can talk more about the particle nature of purpose. Maybe that might help. Maybe might open things up too much, make it more confusing.
Open them up. I'm
but
game.
in the
wide open.
In the grand scheme of things, there's always a balance, right? So me being like 55% female, 45% male, and I would argue, touch wood, like my wife's perfect touch wood for me. She is a female that's freedom oriented. right? So she is driven by freedom. So she wants to, like, everything she does in terms of how she operates things, it's like that 55, like and that's not, my wife's incredibly nurturing. She's an amazing mother, right? Touch wood. But when you sit down with her, it's like, yeah, we want financial freedom, or we want, this to be like, and she's talking about things with freedom is like her heart's deepest expression and desire left unchecked without us trying to have all this, I don't want to call it psychobabble, but it's what comes to mind at the moment, without over like psychoanalyzing it. When I'm speaking to her, it's like, oh yeah, it's all about freedom for her. Whereas for me, it's about love. There's a love for life, touch wood. And yes, when you love life, you live free. Yeah. But there's a love for life, which is driving me, touch wood. And that love is a feminine energy, right? And the freedom to live fully is a masculine energy. That's freedom to live fully. Now those are exactly the same thing. But there's like, as I'm holding the two hands up on the screen, there are two hands. It's like, which way are you coming to it from? And it can be really important to recognize that, because then you understand what's driving you. You can then start to understand your why, right? And if you don't have a clear why, it's very difficult to build something meaningful and lasting, right? So for the longest while, the Inspired Evolutions moniker was live the life you love. Yeah. It could just be live free. And I've tried that. Like, it was for a while. I was like, live the life you love is a long-winded way of saying live free. And I tried live free, but energetically it wasn't the right moniker for the podcast as a tagline. Yeah. It just wasn't.
Well, I think that,
even though it was more succinct.
Yeah, it's just out of alignment for you. But I think that might also be, to get into my psyche, if you will, the way I'm processing this conversation. I think you highlighted another really good exercise there of just asking your why, which is something I've heard so much, and it's so powerful. Of like, why are you doing anything you're doing? Why are you creating this podcast? Why are you running for Congress? Why are you talking to Amrit? Like, all of these things, right? To me, it seems like breaking down that why, and not to mention, the more answers you have for that why, the more powerful it becomes, right? And to me, I see freedom and love right at the top of the list. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other reasons that then kind of boil down underneath it. Some of them egotistical, of course. Some of them egotistically self-serving for others, if you will. Like, I remember for the long time, I had this little phrase I used, which was like, I selfishly want the best for you. So it's like little things like that I can see underneath that why. And so I guess to me, though, again, this is just the way that I'm processing it. I understand. Let me put it like this. I also understand completely what you're saying. I'm just processing it for myself. And the way I'm seeing it is like multiple things being true at one time, kind of is like the way I'm processing it.
And I think that is accurate. Like, in different moments, you will show up as a different person. But even that is, for me, if I had to sit here and coach you, like, I would continue the conversation. If I was your brother and I had to label it, and this is probably inappropriate for me to do so, but the fact that you're so adaptable and you're in different moments willing to show up with different energies generally could mean that you're more inclined towards a male that's operating from a place of love. It could be the case, because generally that's what I find, the chameleon-like nature of people, and that it's a loaded term, but the ability to adapt and to their environment is generally, it's a love thing, because love adapts really quickly, really easily, because it's like, oh, this kid needs this right now, this kid needs that right now, as a mother, and like maternal, like typical energy, as you can sort of see it. So yeah, I can appreciate what you're saying. In different moments, different parts of you show up. But what I'm highlighting, again, just to sort of round out the conversation, if I stack all your moments up and all the things you do in your life up one after the other, and I sort of just did a quick audit on every single thing, in some things you'd be showing up driven for freedom, in some things you'd be showing up driven for love. And in everything, there is freedom and love. There's just a percentage of what you're showing up more for, less for, slightly, right? And then we can take a quick audit and go, well, overarchingly, I'm geared towards freedom, or overarchingly, I'm geared towards love. Like, that's really what's driving me. And if I asked you why enough times, you're like, well, just because
I get what you're coming at. I guess there's a piece
it'll be like, just freedom.
Just pick one, dude. Shut up. But like, I think, and maybe this could be also another reason that I'm having like so much internal contention with like this idea, is just like you even kind of pointed out, like the device, like it creates more division.
The typecasting. Yeah. And so it's definitely not me trying to typecast further. And this is like, as a meditation teacher, I used to say, like, there's, at the time there was 7.6. Now there's 8 billion of us online on the planet. If there's 8 billion people, there's 8 billion different experiences of meditation, because we're all different and unique. But what really is at the heart of, if I had to rebrand spirituality, which sounds so glucky, it would literally just be the word unity and oneness. That's really what spirituality is all about. So I'm definitely not trying to be more divisive. What I am trying to do is give people permission to be themselves. Yeah, and I think that's really important when you're a coach and you're helping people find themselves, because it's like, well, all this news and all this stuff that's coming in doesn't really resonate. It's not really who I am. Allowing the rubber to meet the road really in like a really grounded sense can be like, okay, this is who I am. This is what's driving me. This is my personality. These little insights can be super helpful in going, okay, this is my being. This is what my being wants in this particular lifetime. It seems to have a propensity for X, Y, and Z. This is my general makeup. And then how do I continue to then live into the fullest expression of who I am, right? Which is also the divine and the masculine dance, which is then also, there's a massive yoga in there, which is, the yoga being the word unity, which is like, I am now one with what life is trying to birth through me. Like my personality, the way I like to articulate this, my personality is stacked against my soul. Like my soul is literally just pouring through my personality, and now I am the truest expression of who I was meant to be, right? But if I sit there and for the whole, and I know this intimately because I grew up in a society where masculine male was rewarded for being masculine male, and I always felt like a square peg in a round hole with being a male operating from a place of love. It was just this, it was really odd growing up and just going, that doesn't sound right for me. That doesn't sound right for me. Like three blokes in the playground pulling a prank on somebody. And I was like, why would you do that to someone? Like that didn't feel very nice. And, and I'm like, nah, dude, like I don't feel like I'm a part of that. Like, but then also having to then be groomed a certain way where it's like, that's really funny, right? And it's like, fuck, like that really rubbed me up the wrong way, but now I'm being groomed out of my being into thinking that that's kind of great and funny and hilarious, isn't it? And it's like, now I'm grooming out from my center. Now I've come off my center and I'm in this place where I'm like, oh, how cool is that? And it's like, it's not very cool for you, but you've groomed yourself. Society has built you into somebody that you're not as your truest authentic expression. So then reconciling that, like, actually that's not who I am. Who am I really? And it's like, well, that's where I went awry. Even in that aspect where I went off my center, I was seeking, like I was coming from a place of love, which is like, I didn't want to go against the status quo. So I'm still operating deeply from a place of love, which is like, I want to love everything and everyone around me. And so I'm like adapting myself to kind of be like, oh yeah, maybe that is kind of funny, but it's not really, but I'm saying externally something that's not true. Coming from a place of love, ultimately, at the end of the day, because I'm trying to adapt. And there's, again, that nurturing capability of love, right? And so all of that to say, that's just one moment in a high school playground. Then you start living that out to the nth degree to, then you go to university, then you continue to build, and you, like, your parents told you to get a certain type of degree, your friends told you you're going to be something like that, and then you end up in this completely contorted external outcome of your life, and then you feel like you're completely smothered by it, even though by everybody's judgment and rule, you're like, you're successful. And it's like, I don't feel successful because I'm so far off my center, right? And it's like, what was your center? And it's like, well, let's peel back all the way into the whys. Okay, you've built a life by everybody's modicum and measure of freedom, and you're free. That doesn't mean shit to you.
You're saying if you're someone who wants to be in love, who is in love,
are you in love with the freedom that you've created for yourself? And it's like, actually, no, this feels kind of suffocating. And it's like, why did you build that? You know? And I remember that because I had career misalignment. One of my biggest existential crises was being in the wrong career for 7 years. It was construction. It was typical, like very masculine, very driven. It was brilliant by everybody's thing, by a mean and measure. I'd made it. I was, helping build high-rise towers in, a leading city, like now Australia's largest city, just doing an amazing job at it, touch wood, but for me, it didn't stack up to my values. Like my values were connection, contribution, celebration. All three of these sound somewhat feminine, right? And there was no connection. There was no contribution. There was no celebration. Like there was a little bit of contribution because I was building people homes, but there was no real connection in that. Like I was just building stuff. The people I was working with, I didn't really resonate with. And so all of that to sort of say, like, that was an amazing gig for somebody that is like, yes, this is an amazing job for me to be able to go out, build stuff and do things. And, that's totally fine. I prefer to build relationships with people and also like interface with them and go, how can we build a better life, right? That's more interesting to me in particular. But in that moment, like that was for someone, like that was a very masculine type sort of outcome for the search for freedom, right? It was like, I just want to be free to be me. And so I went along with what society had prescribed for me to the nth degree, get really good grades, do really well at university, did really well at university, got a really good job, got the best job I could get, got this amazing job. And I'm meant to be like, I finally made it. It's like, where have I made it? I don't feel like I've made it. Like, this is not what I love doing. Yeah. Doing. But it's like, for many people, it's like, who cares what you're doing? Like, whether you love it or not, you're doing something amazing, and this feels really enriching to you. And it's like, that wasn't for me. It came back to, what do you really love? And for me, that was the birth point of the podcast. All that career misalignment was like, well, I really love conscious conversations. I really love the depths that we go to in human behavior and psychology and philosophy and, how this all sort of peels together. And I'm just going to start interviewing people that do stuff like this. And then that was the birthplace of the podcast, from a place of pure love, because me running after freedom for like decades, what had taken me further off my center. Yeah. And you could argue that it was a necessary process, like the hero's journey, for me to come full circle to where I needed to go to, touch wood. But all of that to say, I'm not really trying to be divisive. I'm actually trying to allow healing to take place where it needs to, so people that can come home full circle to themselves in a really deep way, so that they can then be unified personality to spirit, their whole being, they're aligned to their values, living out the life that they're meant to live, and it's fully enriching and flowing.
Well, and I fully support that, by the way, which is huge, right? Because in this world, everything you just laid out there, right? I could see a lot of parallels in my own story. Software engineer, everything material was perfect. Lived with 2 beaches within a 30-second walk of my house, surrounded by beautiful women. It just didn't do it for me. I was like, why am I not jumping over? Why do I not have like the most joy in the entire world, right? And so, had that own breaking point for myself. And maybe this is a good question. Do you feel like it can be, if someone goes through this process, right, of figuring out whether they're a male, a love male, or a freedom male, or a love female, or a freedom female, do you think that could ultimately put them in a box after they figure out the answer to that? Because how we were saying you can flow between love and freedom, do you feel like that a box could ultimately be placed around them once establishing one of those things?
Sorry, you dropped out for a quick sec there. The box, can you ask the question?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Right. So just as a quick overview, right? You're saying, okay, the 5 types, which the 5th type might have its own plagues, right? Shadows, if you will. Where if you have let's say masculine man, masculine female, feminine female, or even just love man, freedom man. I get what you're saying. Yep. Do you think once you identify with one of those things, it could create its own box around you from
absolutely. So you can absolutely typecast yourself and then get locked into your limitations around the identity. And, as a coach, I see that all the time. People place themselves into a particular identity and they're locked and loaded into that and they start playing it out. And that's, that's the whole, there's a real spiritual dance there, right? Like it's like nature versus nurture. It's like, who am I really? And then who am I becoming? And that's that dance again between the masculine and feminine on another degree, which is the being versus the becoming. Who are you versus who you're becoming? Yeah. And so some part of, and that's this really interesting thing where I ask everybody on the podcast that's like a spiritual teacher in some way or another. It's like, spiritually, we're completely whole. And yet there's so much healing to be done. Riddle that to me, like it's just like I just can't reconcile those two things. But that's kind of what's happening in this conversation right now, like at that particular, like in response to what you're saying is like, absolutely, like for me, only me and my centering in my heart can I really tell. It's like, oh, that was a healing for me to come back to the identity of being a male identified as, being operating from love. Yeah. Or like, is me identifying as a male operating with love actually taking me further off my center, right? Is it less authentic? Yeah. Is it less who I am? And so I can build an identity around it and have done so in the past. And then also, like, as you've described, over time come to realize, yeah, it's meant to be more and more, like it's meant to be more balanced. But there was a point in my life where holding on to that so dearly was so important. Like the identity of like, yes, I'm a male with love as an energy and it's totally okay to be this way, and championing that. And that was probably like 6-7 years ago that like that healing took place, and it was very dear for me. And now, like for me, it's neither here nor there to some degree. It's like, yeah, I'm aware that was, a realization that I had at that point, and it was really powerful to unlock that. And now I can see that I'm driven by freedom in certain ways, driven by love in certain ways. Do I allow my operating system of love to drive everything? Again, it's present in everything that I do, like the way I run my business. So this is, not good advertising, but let's look at it this way. So as a coach, oftentimes with life coaching, people are going, not oftentimes, maybe 1 in 5 cases, 1 in 10 cases, people are going through a career transition. In that, maybe 20% of the time, someone will be going through a career transition and they will hit financial rock bottom. They're like, oh, I actually don't know how I'm going to make my payments for the next, 2 months for like even rent. Yeah, like that happens. And they're like, oh, sorry, I can't be coached at the moment because I can't afford coaching because I can't make it through these next 2 months. And as a coach, to me, like if I was running a business based on freedom, I'd be looking at my sort of makeup and archetype and everything. And it's like, yeah, cool. Like all good, man. You're free to do you. And, when you're ready, you're free to come back to coaching, see in a quick minute. Yeah. But for me, operating from a place of love, like the way my business works is like, oh, it's amazing that you've hit rock bottom, bro, because you're breaking down to break through, and it's totally fine. I'm going to continue coaching you for the next 2 months on me because there's this essence of like love there, right? Touch wood. And on the other side of it, you just pick back into coaching and we'll continue going, right? And that's happened, touch wood, a few times. And I'm aware that I'm running a business from that place of love rather than the place of freedom, right? Because if it was purely based on freedom, it'd be like my time, my hours, my energy. I'd be like, well, I'm not getting reimbursed for my time, which, significant investment that people put in towards coaching. Then it'd be like, well, this is a vehicle for freedom for me, and I don't show up that way. And I'm okay with it, right? Because people will turn around to me and be like, why are you, like my assistant says it to me, she's like, why are you giving away billable hours? And I'm like, I don't look at it that way. Like, this person's been working through a transformation for the last 6 months. They've finally gotten to the nexus of the transformation. And I'm, as their coach, meant to abandon them in that moment. It's like, doesn't feel right for me. Yeah. And so like, let's go through the actual transformation together. And now we pop out on the other side and we can work through a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And, you then unpack that and they become clients for life, because they know that they can trust you to be there with them because there's less of that maternal love energy around for a lot of people, right? It's a great business decision. It's not even coming from that place. It's just like, how do I want to show up? How would I want someone to show up for me? It's like you're just playing into who you are, which is I'm Amrit. Yes, I'm male. I come from a place of love,
Well, I mean, if you break this down even from a business decision, it seems to me like it's the ultimate business decision, right? Because it's compassionate. And then you're also securing someone, hypothetically for life, because that this system you have works. So I don't know.
But the first few times I ran that experiment, I didn't know that was how it was going to work out.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Okay,
I didn't
gotcha.
know that they were going to end up being clients for life. I didn't know that. But it just didn't, It was like rubbing the cat the wrong way to let them go on their own to figure out their transformation after we'd been working so hard on it. Because I'm genuinely invested in them from a place of love. If it was like, this whole inspired evolution thing is about me being free, then it would be like, okay, like my billable hours are my billable hours. I'd have much tighter boundaries. Let's just be real about it. I'd have much tighter boundaries around my time and energy and where I'd be investing it, touch wood, right? Because that's that. Like, if I'm thinking about my fear coach mate, right, who's hyper masculine, there is no way he'd be doing that. He'd be like, and he'd be coming from a beautiful place where I was like, you need to figure that out. Like, now you don't have coaching, you need to figure that out. Like, that's the hyper masculine version of it. It's like, I'll see you in 2 months. Don't fuck around. Get through this. I mean, see you in 2 months.
I don't know.
To
me, that feels like an unhealed masculine, though. Whether you call it hyper masculine, that feels unhealed.
Yeah, the hyper word is probably identifying with unhealed, but it is also like, I probably blow it out. Like, I doubt he would do that, but also like, just because some people may know who I'm talking about, but also it's just me painting a point and a picture of like what masculine looks like versus what love looks like. I'm using the polarities intentionally to sort of give you an idea of how it shows up. But yeah, would he coach? I don't think he would, but he wouldn't talk to someone like that. But he probably wouldn't. I don't imagine him coaching someone through the periods where they can't afford to pay him. But I imagine he would be he would be supportive about it. He'd be like, look, that's okay. That happens. Life gets to these points. Like, he's a coach. He's amazing. He does have a lot of compassion. But yeah, but it does paint the picture, right? And when you said it's the ultimate business decision, that's where it's really interesting, and that's something that I've had to come to learn is that, and that's the current shift in awakening that I'm sort of discussing earlier, the being versus becoming, and how there's a shift that's happening. We're encouraged to be more our being rather than who society's constructing us to become, like you said, like your background, like, getting the amazing job and like being in this place, but it didn't, like, I was becoming somebody, and it's like, it's not the right, just be you, right? So my best business strategy is to be me. And touch wood, it pays off. Yeah, sure, that's great, but I didn't know it was going to pay off in the moment when I was executing it. But I had enough touch wood work on myself to then realize that I'm like, this doesn't feel right for me. I've got to do what feels right for me. Yeah. So another example in my business, the way that I run things, like at some point it was like, I've coached people like 7 years ago. I haven't heard from them. What are they up to? Like, are they okay? Like, is everything good? Not that like, oh my God, they must be failing without me.
In a ditch somewhere.
But this whole aspect of like connection's my highest value. I haven't heard from them in the longest while. I want to connect. Like, I was so deeply intimate with them for like 6 months of their journey, and then they just, they got through the transformation and they're off. I'd just like to touch base. So every 6 months, I touch base and I do an hour call with my clientele list from the back. And like, sometimes someone books in, sometimes someone else books in, and having coached hundreds of people now, it's an intense period, like for that. Every 6 months, like there's like 15, 20 hours that sort of go like that of dropping into calls with people, but it's really nourishing for me to see them. And sometimes one of them will turn around and be like, oh yeah, I need to jump back on coaching. Great business decision, great execution, right? When you look at it that way. Yeah. But I didn't know that's what was going to happen, right? It was just me doing me, which felt like, and this is, my whole businessing, I find myself saying this is like, what would it look like if we were good humaning? Right. And I just see that all the time. It's like good humaning. It's like someone's asked for a refund. They were meant to be coaching for 6 months. They're only in 2 months. And it's like, you know what? Give them the refund. Like, if they can't make it work, well, I'm not here to make their life harder. I'm here to make their life better. Now, if I was operating from a place of freedom, it's like that financial support meant something to me in terms of freedom. And that's not to be demonized. People should have an awareness. They've invested something. They've made a commitment. If I'm coming from a masculine place, absolutely. Like, you need to honor your commitments, etc. Like, you don't get a refund. Sorry, bro. Like, that's just not happening here. But that's not my operating system, right? I'm coming from a place of like, okay, fair enough. I believe in, how me showing up and being me and my business reflecting my values and my being, touch wood, to the best of my ability, is me playing the best business card that I can, right? Is me being the best leader. And this is where the stuff starts to bleed from leadership into leadership coaching as well. When I have those conversations in organizational environments, it's like giving permission to people to be themselves. It's like command and control is what everybody thinks they have to be as a leader. And it's like, no, you can be coach and inspire. There are so many different ways to lead. And what's your natural propensity? Because the more you try to be someone you're not, this goes back to what we were saying before, being off your center, the less effective you are, right? So I know like all the business techniques that, having had so many business coaches on the podcast and featured them and had conversations with them. But at the end of the day, the stuff that really makes the most difference is where I'm just being authentically me, touch wood. There's not a scarcity mindset. There's not a fear mindset. It's just like, hey, like this works really well. And then subsequently it turns out is that, me good humaning, which is like me just giving myself permission to be more me, despite it not making sense financially or, by the normal constructural societal norms, ends up being the thing that makes the most difference and people love the most about me and touch wood wanting to work with me, if I can even say that. That sounds super egotistical, but I'm sure that that's probably at the heart of it. People are like, oh, I like the way Amrit shows up, and that's probably a big part of why they want to work with myself, because it's different to everything else that they've experienced out there, because everybody else is playing by a prescribed set of rules. Whereas I'm just trying to touch wood, just not even play by rules. I'm just like, this feels right. This, is what I would do if I was left to my own vices, per se.
Sure. And I bet even to add on to that, right, it's talking from like a coaching or from a leadership perspective, if you will. Both of these ideas, right, the one that I said was like the ultimate, and then you have this like one where you go back and check in with people. If you took someone who that didn't feel comfortable with and they still enacted those, I bet that it wouldn't work. I bet that just...
And that's the thing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So great point. So there'll be people that will listen into this and be like, oh yeah, that's what I now need to do in order to have a successful coaching business. It's like,
and it's just going to cause them more stress.
And in fact, for most people, as I'm tuning into what I'm saying, it's probably a great recipe for burnout. Like, why would you coach like 20 people every 6 months, complimentary? Like, why would you do that? Just because they're in your existing clientele list. If you're as busy as I am, touch wood, it makes no sense. But for me, and again, this comes back to our values and this, flow and connection, contribution, celebration. Like today's conversation for me started at 5 a.m. Yeah. And I've got energy to be here, touch wood, because I enjoy the conversations. I get to connect with you. I get to connect with your audience. There's a contribution that's happening. Hopefully, touch wood, this is valuable. And there's a celebration of life, of ideas, of experiences, right? So this is my values. So I'm going to be energized by this, right? Touch wood. So I'm going to be energized by me doing those calls, even though there's an extra 20 hours. Those 20 hours is like, those are a gift for me because I get to connect, I get to contribute, I get to celebrate. That's who I am. Now, if I get, again, somewhat metaphysical about this, that's what the universe put me here to do, because those are my values, right? And you can be as clear as I am on my values. And this is, we talked about this earlier, this is inevitable, this is going to happen. For those that are tuning in, yourself included, like if you want to discover your values, 20 minutes from now, you could have your values. inspiredevolution.com/values or amrit.coach/values. 20-minute masterclass, you'll be clear on your values, as clear as I am on mine, right? So I know that connection, contribution, celebration is who I am. And the more I can lean into that, the more my spirit is being who Amrit was, is incarnated to be. Touch wood, right? And so in that, what are your values and what lines up for you? You like, if your connection and contribution and celebration aren't your highest values, every 6 months doing calls with like 20 people, if it doesn't line up to your values and your values are like abundance, growth, and freedom, that doesn't play into abundance, growth, and freedom. And it's not wrong to have those values. Those are your values. But my strategy doesn't make sense for you, because why would you then do 20 calls every 6 months? Is it bringing you abundance? No. Are you growing? Maybe a little bit. Is there freedom? No. right? So that's where, again, understanding your values, coming back to the individual that you really are, to understand how to fully allow, your personality, to allow your soul to pour into your everyday living, however you want to articulate that, is super important. And there's a part of the thread of the conversation which is back to that masculine feminine conversation. Yes, it's like, I'm not trying to be divisive in what I'm sharing in terms of like, get clear on your values, and it's, but we are all different in this 3D reality that we're living in. And there's an incredible amount of unity that's available for us when we give ourselves permission to be who we are truthfully. And then that allows our spiritual self to show up as part of our like personality self, our soul to pour through our personality as well, like articulating, or our spirit to pour through our personality. And the interesting thing is then there's a different type of energy that's pouring through your life, touch wood, if I can say it that way, because you're animated differently. Like I said, touch wood, this conversation started at 5 a.m. If I hadn't mentioned that, I'm sure some people would not have been able to tell.
I definitely
and so there's, that aspect of like, when you're doing what means something to you, you show up to the nth degree. And that's back to your point, which is like, for certain people, what I've just shared is great business advice. For other people, it's terrible business advice. And in many ways, I would say it's terrible business advice, because you should protect your billable hours. Yeah. But for me, I'm creating something, and this is kind of how I want to create it. It just feels right to me. Touch wood.
Yeah, it seems like that crux of like what feels right is usually the best place to tap into, and at least act on. It seems like at least act on that. I think one of the I don't know if you had him on your podcast. I feel like I saw him on there. Was the guy who does Bashar? I'm forgetting his name.
Oh,
Did
yes, Daniel. No.
No, you didn't. Okay, but the one thing that he always says is that act on your highest excitement, and to me, that always seemed like, he talks about a lot of stuff, but that seemed like always like the best information I could always have, because you have no idea, like that's going to take you to that next place. And it seems like for you, acting on that highest excitement of let me rephrase it. It seems like it excites you to get up at 5 a.m., which I would not have noticed. It seems like it excites you to go back and speak with people whenever they can't even afford your coaching program, which I guess if you listen to this podcast, you just got 2 free months of coaching.
Told you it was bad advertising.
Your entire client list could be like, yeah, I don't have money this month.
Yeah.
But to my point, right, is it feels like that's your highest excitement versus, maybe 50%, 70% of other people, to them, that would be their lowest excitement. They're going to, and so it seems like that play of like, is this going to be my highest excitement or no? Like, what's more, is it more or less exciting to do this?
Yeah, and so that's that's the name of the inspired evolution, right? It's like what inspires you. And there's this real, like, chose the words quite carefully. But yeah, like inspiration, it's like you can't fake your inspiration. I remember when I was like in high school, when I used to I was dating, one of the things I used to be very conscious of is not that I was the clown, but I would, on a first date, at least try and gauge the other person's sense of humor, like at least make them laugh once or twice. That would make for a good date, but then also it would give me a really good like insight to who they are, right? Because you can't fake your humor. You can't fake your laughter, right? It's like what you find funny. And then, there's that kind of laughter which just happens. It's like, oh, like that was hilarious. It's like and if you find something completely hilarious and you share that with someone, they're just like, okay. And you're like, oh, wow, I'm not sure if this is going to work. It's like, that's really who I am, and like, so same way, you can't fake your inspirations, right? And there's a very big difference between motivation and inspiration, which, I struggled with for a while back there when I first started. It was like, you're a motivational speaker. And I'm like, nah, man, motivation as a word, like, blah, blah, blah. Motivation is like you're pumping up your tires, and motivation, there's a lot we can talk about in terms of how it's misunderstood in society. To make that a one sentence conversation, motivation, people are expecting it to show up so they can do an activity. Generally, it shows up midway through doing an activity. That's the truest sense of motivation. And inspiration is very different altogether. So motivation is external. Inspiration is from within. Yeah. And a really great sort of diagnosis tool is like, sometimes you'll be looking at something and you're like, oh, like that'll just happen. Like, Like you just be like, I'll be watching a podcast and it's like, oh, insight. Oh, like, oh, you drew in breath. Like that literally gave you prana. Like something happened and you gained mana. Like how did that just happen? Yeah. And that's your truest inspiration. Like you've inspired, like you've literally drawn breath. You've literally drawn what just happened into your being. It naturally wants to infuse itself into you. That's inspiration, right? And then you start looking at the etymology of the word. Inspiration is like to infuse with spirit. Yeah. And so inspired evolution, like you said, like live your highest excitement. It's like what inspires you to be better, what inspires you on your path, on your journey. That's that inspired evolution.
Interesting. What do you, this is kind of like, that's a great piece of advice, but it's even making me think here, like, you know, you've done 360 podcasts over an hour long, most of them. So, you know, you're up to like 400 hours of talking to some of the, you know, let's say brightest people in the industry. What do you feel like might be like one of the top number one, top 5 best pieces of advice that you've surmised from doing your podcast?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. So the biggest piece that I personally take away from all the different people that I've podcasted as a whole is a very simple lesson that's quite huge to digest, is that our biggest pain, our biggest challenge is our biggest gift. I'll put it that way. And oftentimes we unpack this a lot in my coaching sessions. And what do I mean by that? So one of the people for the longest while that was, you know, one of the best episodes on the most received episodes, best performing episodes of the Inspired Evolution, was this lady, Marissa Peer. She's a hypnotherapist. She was like 40 and people were telling her she wasn't going to amount to anything. She was a cleaner, she was a maid. She was consistently told, oh, you're just a maid, you're just a cleaner, you're just a maid, you're just a cleaner, you're just this, you're just that, and you're just this. Now she's hypnotherapist to like royal families, stars, all these like celebrities and all this sort of stuff. And her message is that you are enough. You're enough. She spent her whole life being told she wasn't enough and that she was worthless. And then she had to dig deep and find that self-worth. And then now she like trains thousands of people to train people like the power of words in their mind and hypnotherapy and trance. And then, you know, her core message is that you're enough, and it heals you. You're enough, you're enough. She's got this movement where people lipstick it on windows, like write it all over their walls, you know, and it's a profound message. But not only is it a profound message, it's profound because of the context. In philosophy, they say this context is king, right? So I could sit here and tell you that you're enough and it may not mean anything to you, but when you listen to Marissa's story and the way she shares it and the way it arrives for you, whew, right? And so again, her biggest challenge as she worked through that is her biggest gift. Now, you unpack that, it's starting to get very Dave Campbell, and it is the hero's journey, right? So my biggest challenge, I struggled with depression for 6 years. Meditation and mindfulness reconstituted my life, right, is the way I share this, right? And there's a whole nother story in there. But that was one of my and so I became a meditation teacher, right? And then from there, like career misalignment was 7 years of like career misalignment, which was like literally feeling like Neo in the Matrix plugged in, like, there's something wrong, touch wood, right? And then healing that was like, okay, on the backside of that, once I figured that out, I was like, okay, this Inspired Evolution, this podcast, the coaching and everything, it became, oh, wow, like I became a life coach because it's like so many people's lives, I don't want to say are out of order, but are out of order, out of alignment is the way I would say it actually. And that became my work. One of my mentors has an amazing personal development company, turns over like $20 to $50 million a year. Yeah, incredible company. And he himself struggles a little bit with Asperger's. And so he's really challenged by connection. Like he just can't form like 100% robust connection. And the thing that people get from his organization the most, like yes, the content's amazing, but the thing they get the most out of is the lifelong connections and friends that they make. And so it's this real interesting thing where our biggest challenges are our biggest gifts. And the people that are like on the podcast have a certain level of mastery to some degree, if you want to put it that way, Touchwood, is because they've figured that out to some level and integrated that. Either they're conscious of it or they're not. But it makes for like, and you know, it goes to show like you don't just do 360 episodes. Yeah, Touchwood, not to make it sound like, hey, I did 360 episodes, but like, you know, we've been talking about that number quite a bit in this episode. You do that because you've been misaligned for 7 years and you're like, this is not working. There's a different way. I'm inspired to evolve. Help. And if I get the help, I'd be honored to help. And so you continue down that path and it did help. And so you're like, wow, it worked. Okay, let's continue this. This is important. You know, the why runs deep because of the challenge that you faced. Yeah. And you can't fake the challenges either. So again, we're back to that authenticity piece. But yeah, overarchingly, that's the big lesson. Your biggest challenges, your biggest gifts. And to just round that out as I leave you with something inspiring is it's really great once you start to recognize that in your own system and being and life as true. Because then when you're going through some really tough stuff, you're like, you start to roll up your sleeves a little bit. You're like, yeah. I'm having a tough time, but I know it's a formative time. Like I know something good's going to come out of this, you know? What is that? You know, and you approach life very differently. You kind of transcend the victim mentality.
For sure. No, because that was definitely a lot of my motivation as well. I mean, first of all, it's an amazing thing, but then also like that was one of my motivations as well, which was this idea of, okay, where do I go from here? Like once you realize you're somewhere you not want to be, it's like, well, where do you go next? And it seems like podcasts, especially ones where you bring other guests on, it really gives you so many different perspectives that you just didn't know what to do without. Like even when I started my podcast, I didn't know about, like I knew about spirituality, but like I didn't know anything about it. And then just taking, like, it wasn't until like episode 14, I think, where I was like, oh, I want to focus in on spiritual people. And of course now it's like even growing in different ways and it's shifting. But I bring all this up because I think just that core premise of just having this ability to talk to someone, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, like it's been so therapeutic and growing for me that like, I just hope like, at least, you know, for myself, if only like, even if no one else listened to this, it's just, it's such a, it's helped me so much in that process.
It's such a trip, isn't it? Like I couldn't, even when I was podcasting, because I've helped many people set up their podcast. Like it's one of the courses in the programs I've got is like how to set up a podcast, how to set up a YouTube podcast. These are just courses that, you know, once I find myself teaching people the same thing a few times, I just systemize it, put it into a course. But yeah, it's exactly to your point. Like I can't believe I'm going to have a conversation with someone I'm inspired by and they're going to give me an hour of their time, where before, like, it was like, how do I just reach out to someone that, like, you know, like inspires me to the nth degree? Like, usually these people are out of reach. And it's like, just ask them for an hour of their time to just sit down and shoot the shit with me. And then you sit down, you have the conversation with people that inspire you, and then your mind, like you said, shifts. And the only caveat is that you have to share this on with the world. And then you meet a like-minded tribe of people that are into what you're into. And I was like, what's the downside? I'm trying to find off where's the trade-off. And it's like, yeah, your time and energy for some people. But if you, again, like if it stacks up on your values, like for me, connection, contribution, celebration, this was, you know, the best thing that could have ever happened, Touchwood, the podcast. Like I get to connect. There's a contribution there. There's a celebration there. It's a bunch of fun. It leans into who I am. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a real blessing and it's a real school as well. The way I think you and I approach it, it's my own school. Like one of my friends reflected this back to me. It's like you're learning what you want to learn. Every week is your own syllabus and curriculum. You're going to see your own lecturers and teachers and they're teaching you what you want to learn. You get to ask your own questions. It is your own school and we're all learning along together. It's pretty great.
It is. That's a great way to put it. You're creating your own school of just whatever it is you want to learn. Yeah. I mean, Amrit, this feels like a great place to just put a little bow on top of this conversation. So first of all, thank you so much. A lot of wisdom in this podcast. I've definitely learned a lot. Speaking of, I love leaving some time at the end for my guest. If you want to say anything directly to the audience, words of encouragement, plug your stuff, whatever you feel called to share.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, man, I really appreciate the platform that you've got and just how you're showing up for it as well. It's really beautiful, brother. I really appreciate you. And yeah, we spent a lot of time discussing things today that also, I think back to your point as a podcaster, like there's a lot of information that comes in, and it's great to be able to discern after a while what truth really is so that we can live our highest truth. The message in my heart, which I've just been carrying for the longest while, touch wood, and I thought it was just me on this mission, which was a fallacy, but nonetheless, is that your health is your purpose and your purpose is your health. And for most people, they don't really care, I've noticed, about their purpose as much, but they do care about their health a lot. And in fact, the two things are completely woven together and are exactly the same thing in many ways. When you're living out your truest purpose, and I just know this because I struggled with really poor mental health for 6 years, and it's because I was completely off purpose, right? My life had deteriorated. Touch wood, there's a whole story in there. The key thing was how important it was to find purpose and come back to my truest self and the true purpose of like my soul for being here and going, right, this is what I'm really, and as soon as I started to lean into that even a little bit, my mental health started to recover, right? And I was like, wow, I'm like truly expressing who I was put here to be. And that's that wisdom of like expression is the opposite of depression, right? And so your health is your purpose and your purpose is your health. It starts with mental health in that space, but then it quickly tumbles down into physical stuff as well, right? Like it's all there, touch wood. And I thought for the longest while, like I said, that this was me carrying and championing this torch, like health is purpose, purpose is health. But the whole science of Ayurveda, which is this ancient Indian system of health, birthplace of yoga and all this sort of stuff, the whole science of Ayurveda, which arguably gave birth to a lot of traditional Chinese medicine. You can argue that. I'll let somebody else argue that. Right? It's like all the elements and your doshas and your makeup and stuff. And it's a vast body of knowledge. All of that exists to facilitate your dharma. And your dharma is your purpose. So Ayurveda exists to unlock and shift and manipulate you to be able to fully live into your dharma the way that you are put here to do. And so dharma and Ayurveda, like there's that symbiosis between health and purpose. People have been championing this message way longer, touch wood, than I've been around. But I think it's really important, especially with where we are right now. 1 and 2 are anxious or depressed. And that sense of purpose, like even just coming back to the present moment, learning how to build a relationship with the now. Once you're here in the now, it's like, who am I? What am I doing with myself? What is the purpose of me being alive in this time? It's a big question. How do you activate it? How you live into your true self? But it's such an epic blessing if you can unlock that. And you end up with random things like today's podcast, right? Like such a gift. And, you wake up early and you do something that's really meaningful and impactful and you're hoping that it impacts others and it's on your path. And you leave touchwood revitalized for having done something like that, as opposed to like being drained, because again, health is purpose, purpose is health, touchwood.
That's beautiful. Beautiful words of advice. Well, thanks again, man, dude. Honor, pleasure. I know I learned, which means I'm hoping other people learned as well. If someone knew everything that he said there, then I don't know, maybe you need to come on the podcast, but dude, thank you so much for being here. It was an honor. It was a pleasure. Thank you for sharing the space with me. Thank you for getting up at 5 a.m. That's amazing as well.
It's Clayton, it's an absolute honor. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, your questions, and again, your platform and the way that you've had me on today. It's really meant a lot to me. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's great to hear. Guys, go check out Inspired Evolution, which is his podcast full of over 360 podcasts, which is, I can't even put that into words, being a fellow podcaster. So go check it out. I know there's probably something on there for everybody, especially if you like this podcast, you're going to like that one as well. So I appreciate it. And if you guys don't go to see those podcasts, then we'll have to talk about it when we all see each other in the sixth dimension.